All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Preston Cooper, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Welcome to Free the Economy, Preston.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So now, first, can you give us kind of a micro explanation of what FREOPP is? We actually had Ovik Roy, a FREOPP, several episodes ago, but for people who might not have heard that episode, um, give us a quick background on what the organization is and how your work on higher education fits into that overall mission.
Sure. So, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, or FREOPP, is a market friendly think tank. We're focused on policy solutions that are aimed at improving the lives of Americans living below the median income, with a particular focus on lowering the cost of living for sectors of the economy that have experienced rampant cost inflation, like healthcare, education, housing, energy. Basically, if Americans are concerned about the cost of something, we probably have a scholar working on it.
Great. Now, obviously, one of the top debates in the world of higher education in the past few years has been student loan and student loan debt, and what we're going to do, what we're all going to do about that. And but before we get into what we're going to do about it going forward, can you give us a little background on how did we get here? How has the way we finance higher education changed? And like the federal government, for example, has basically sort of taken over a lot of what had used to have been a process that was sort of between students, banks, and colleges.
That's right. So the federal government, I think their big mistake was funding higher education as if it's a surefire investment that it always pays off. And so the federal government, you mentioned, has the $100 billion per year federal student loan program, which basically, if you're an eligible high school graduate attending an accredited college, you can get a no questions asked loan from the federal government to pay for your education. You can also get Pell Grants, tuition tax credits, lots of other sorts of funding streams available there. The issue is that not all higher education actually delivers a financial return for students. There are a lot of degree programs, certificate programs out there, which actually leave a lot of students worse off than they would have been if they'd never gone to college at all. Sometimes that's because the credential doesn't have a great return in the labor market. Sometimes because it's that school has a very high dropout rate. So a lot of people are taking on debt but not getting the benefits of the degree. And sometimes it's just a good old fashioned cost. Sometimes tuition is just far too high for the benefit that is being given by that degree, by that college. And so students end up taking on far too much debt relative to their earnings prospects after graduation. And when this happens, we find that people default on their student loans. The taxpayer is left holding the bag. And we see increased demands for student loan forgiveness because students feel like they've been betrayed by the higher education system and, by extension, the federal government.
Well, yeah, and so you mentioned something I think sometimes gets left out of the student loan burden conversation, which is a lot of the people who are the worst off are people who actually didn't finish their degree in the first place, but took out a bunch of loans, in to get in that direction. Whereas even though, like you said, some of these degrees aren't as valuable as others, but almost any degree is worth more than 3 years of student loan debt with no degree.
That's right. Yes. So if you start college, you really had better finish, or else you're probably going to be ending up in not a great place. So we see that 70% of students who default on their federal student loans, so people who go more than a year without making a payment, 70% of those people are dropouts. They never finished any degree or certificate at their institution. And a great irony with this is that these people are often only taking on $5,000, $10,000 of debt because they go to college for a year, maybe 2 years. They drop out. They decide this isn't for me. Life intervenes. They have that debt, but they don't have the benefits of the degree, and so they end up in a place where they can't pay back even that $5,000 or $10,000 worth of debt. And this ends up hurting their credit score. They'll often get their wages garnished. They'll get their tax refunds seized. And this is an entirely avoidable thing. If the federal government were more diligent about what kinds of institutions it's making loans to, not necessarily making loans to institutions with very high rates of non-payments, not necessarily making loans to students who might not be able to get a good return on investments, we could avoid a lot of this pain.
But yeah, so that's the question in terms of reform. Do we just roll back the clock to before the federal government had this much control over student loans and was sort of like in charge of pumping out this much in consumer debt? Uh, go back to whenever that would have been, whatever year, 10, 20, 30 years ago. Was the system better before, or do we just need a whole new framework for financing higher education in America?
Yes. Well, so I do think that, if we were to roll back the clock all the way to 1965, when the Higher Education Act was first passed and the kind of the first iteration of the federal student loan program came into being, I mean, there was a strong case for the pre 1965 status quo. Students were getting some loans on the private market. The number of people going to college was a lot smaller then, so not as many people were getting loans to go to college. But the people who were getting loans tended to be folks for whom college was going to be a pretty good bet. Of course, then the federal government came in, expanded it. Now we have tons of people going to college. We have tuition rising, and a lot of those people are benefiting from it, but a lot of those people are ending up in a worse place. I think it might be difficult at this point to roll back the clock all the way to 1965 because the financing system that we have is very entrenched. But I think that there are more incremental reforms that we can make to make this federal student loan program work better for students. Number one is we can force colleges to be co-signers on the loans. So we can say to colleges, if you want money from the federal government, you have to give us some sort of guarantee that your students are actually going to be able to pay back the loans that we're giving you. And if the students are not able to pay back their loans, either because you have a high dropout rate or because your tuition's too high or your degrees just aren't worth anything in the labor market, we should hold the college accountable for those unpaid portions of the student loans. So that the college will have a direct incentive to actually provide education that has economic value instead of just trying to maximize the volume of loans that it's taking on from the federal government.
And this is an angle that I think you've done a lot of work on, these sort of like return on investment in college degrees, which institutions and which majors have graduates end up earning the most. So in one sense, we've sort of always thought about college this way because we've always assumed a degree from, say, a famous school like Harvard or Yale probably has you're probably that graduates probably get ended up with greater earning opportunities than from a small state school, for example. But obviously the work you've done looks at it in a lot more detail. I think one of those studies was like 17,000 different majors and graduate permutations at different colleges across the country. Other than the obvious that some are more valuable than others, what has that big volume of data that you've churned through kind of taught you about how higher education works?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we at FREOPP have undertaken a project to basically quantify the financial returns of tens of thousands of degree and certificate programs out there. All the way from a certificate in licensed practical nursing, all the way up to a professional degree in medicine or law, and every intermediate stop along the way. So we look at what is the estimated increase in earnings that you'll get attributable to this degree over the course of your lifetime, and we compare that to the cost, your tuition, your time spent out of the labor force, the cost of books and supplies, and so forth. We find that most degrees do have a positive return on investment or ROI, but there are a significant number that do not. And this often depends on the field of study. People who major in engineering or nursing or economics or business or computer science tend to have a very strong probability that those degrees are going to pay off for them. But folks who major in other fields like psychology, philosophy, art, music, and people who get a lot of master's degrees, which are very expensive and don't have a whole lot of labor market value, these people often end up worse off than they would have been if they had never gone to college at all. And it's those fields where we find a lot of the student loan distress, the student loan defaults are concentrated. So we think that this can be a tool, not just for students to try and make a better decision about where to go to college, but also for policymakers to figure out, okay, we're seeing that the federal student loan program has these huge default rates. It's taking these huge losses. Maybe we should start thinking about, reining the federal student loan program in and making sure that we're, while when we're going to fund colleges, we're funding colleges that are actually getting their students a return on investment.
So I wonder, why have kind of students and parents not assessed schools and degree programs like this more in the past? If it is it because to a certain some people have this idea about higher education that it's sort of very lofty and high-minded and it's supposed to cultivate your mind and that it's sort of crass to put a put a price on that, or have we just not had the kind of detailed data that you and your colleagues have produced be able to make these comparisons in the first place.
Well, I think for a long time, people would look at the raw gap between the wages of people who with a 4-year bachelor's degree and the wages of people with only a high school diploma, and they'd say, "Oh, if you look at this average, college is a great investment. People will get this huge increase in earnings." Of course, that's not true for all majors. That doesn't take into account the cost of college, and of course, that doesn't take into account the risk that you're not going to complete. But I think people are starting to wake up to this reality that not all college degrees are created equal, and that there are some which are going to leave you worse off, that are not going to make you economically better off. And we have seen students start to vote with their feet a little bit. So we have seen that the number of new graduates in fields like engineering and computer science has gone way up over the last 10 years or so. I think students are starting to realize that these fields have a stronger payoff, and by contrast, the number of new bachelor's degrees produced in other fields which don't have as strong a payoff has been going down. So students are starting to figure this out. I do think that there is still a space for policy to play a role, because one thing that universities have been doing is, because they're getting the same payment from the federal government regardless of what major students pursue, they're actually capping, restricting access to some of the more lucrative majors, right? Because it's all the same to them. They're going to get that student loan from the government regardless of whether the student majors in computer science or anthropology. So why not restrict access to the computer science major, which is more expensive to run? So that's why I think that we still do need the federal government to come in and say, okay, if you want to get these loans from taxpayers, you're going to have to start producing results. And if you put that requirement on colleges, that starts to give them an incentive to open up these higher ROI majors to more students who could benefit from financially from those degrees.
So if we had a system like that, do you think we would have more standalone like engineering and nursing schools instead of big integrated universities with every possible department? Like, would it make sense for, say, if you had a state system where you have a state operates multiple, it has a big flagship university, it has the A&M version, it has it has its fleet of community colleges. Uh, would a state end up having some of those like standalone? They'd still be, 4-year or 4-year plus master's degree programs, but would you have just computer science academy, engineering academy, nursing academy, in addition to the regular colleges and universities?
I think that's certainly possible. I think that one of the reasons behind the rising cost of college is that too many universities are simply trying to do too much. They try to have too many departments at the same time. They try to do it all. They try to basically have 30, 40 different majors in all sorts of different fields, and of course hire all the faculty to support all those different majors. But I think that if we look at the rest of the economy, if we go back to Adam Smith, we find that firms and individuals can thrive by specializing. And that I do think that the future of higher education should go in the direction of universities figuring out, what they're good at and trying to really specialize there. So we might see, standalone engineering schools, standalone computer science schools, standalone nursing schools. I don't know. I would like to make sure that the incentives are there for colleges to serve students well, to make sure that students are getting that return on investment, and then kind of let the market take it from there. So if it works better as a standalone school, that's great. If it works better as integrated into a larger university, that's great too. Just so long as we make sure that colleges have the incentive to keep costs down, to make sure students are getting a degree in a field that's going to lead to good labor market outcomes, to make sure that students aren't dropping out at an inordinately high rate. As long as those incentives are there for colleges, we should let the market work, let different schools experiment with what works, and find out the best way to serve students.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about how this, again, relates back to, FREOPP's mission of helping people who are in sort of like the lower half of the economic, ladder, where I feel like some people, if they hear the message that, the federal government should be restricting student loans, shouldn't be giving as many or underwriting as many, and shouldn't be as widely available, people say, but people who come from poor families need those loans to go to college, and that would, disproportionately affect them negatively if they didn't have as much access to student loan financing. But the sort of response to me seems to be that by focusing on degrees that will actually pay you a wage, that will actually make you successful in the future. That is what students from poor families and disadvantaged backgrounds need more than anything else, because it's the trust fund kid that can pay, like their parents or grandparents will pay for them to get that master's degree in film studies from Columbia, or whatever, that expensive impractical degree, and they'll be fine, right? They're it's the people from privileged backgrounds who are fine with the current system for the most part, right? It's the people, it's actually the people who are just trying to get their like first generation college education, it seems, that need this more kind of practical results driven approach than anyone.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we tend to think of college as this engine of economic mobility, but the research we've done at FREOPP shows that's only true in certain cases. You have to make sure that you're going to an institution with good graduation rates. You have to make sure that you're majoring in a relatively practical field, and you have to make sure that you're not paying too much. And this is the whole reason that we have the federal student loan program, is to make sure that students have access to education that's going to deliver economic mobility. If we see that education is not always delivering economic mobility for those students, well, we need to change the system to make sure the incentives are in place for colleges to actually deliver on that promise. We have to say to colleges, if you want this federal money, if you want this taxpayer money, you're going to have to start delivering results. If you want to charge somebody $200,000 to get a master's degree in film from Columbia University, which is a real degree, by the way. That is that's something that if somebody can come up with 200K, sure, they can do that, but please don't ask taxpayers to pay for it, and please don't pretend for lower income students like that's something that's going to make them financially better off.
Well, yeah, you know, and I wonder what you think about suggestions that, like you said, there's one thing we can do is change the incentives in the system, which will hopefully lead to better outcomes. Um, but then there's some people who would like to have a more sort of aggressive, prescriptive way of changing, of kind of directing the outcomes that they would like to see, or in higher education. And so one probably more benign one, I think, is that especially a lot of people on the center right have said, well, there's too many people going to college in the first place. They shouldn't be going to college. They should be going to trade school. They should be learning how to be a plumber, a carpenter, an HVAC, engine repairman, fill in the blank. Um, and we need policy to specifically push, nudge, whatever word you want to use, kids from low value degrees into trade schools. Do you think, one, what do you think about that? But also, do you think you would even need, even if you did want to do that, would you need a policy specifically to do that? Or would you just need the kind of things we've already talked about, which is like more accountability in sort of like financing, would lead more young students in that direction anyway?
That's a great question. So I want to start off with kind of an optimistic statistic, which is that the number of people participating in registered apprenticeships has doubled over the past 10 years. Apprenticeships, these are jobs in the trades, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. You take an apprenticeship, you get trained up in this field, and you end up with a job that pays you a very high wage. And so more and more individuals are realizing that this is a great path to economic mobility, and they're taking advantage of it. I do think that there is more that policy can do to make sure that, apprenticeships, trade schools, stuff that is not the traditional 4-year college route is operating on a level playing field with, what we think of as the traditional bachelor's degree. So right now, if you want to get funding from the federal government, there's a list of kind of stipulations that you have to go through. You have to get accreditation. Your programs have to be a certain minimum number of clock hours and so forth. I think that we can make sure that we are raising the standards for those programs in terms of outcomes. Make sure that these programs are delivering students a return on investment, but also broaden eligibility for those federal funding streams. So say allow students to use their Pell Grants, which is a financial aid program for low income students, allow them to use their Pell Grants for the classroom components of apprenticeships, or allow them to use Pell Grants for short-term workforce training programs that lead to good jobs. I think there are ways that we can level the playing field with regard to federal funding so that more students can take advantage of these sorts of opportunities, which do have a proven pathway to economic mobility. And we might see that students migrate to trade schools, to apprenticeships, to other alternatives on their own and migrate away from the bachelor's degree if we make sure that the playing field is level.
Nice. So, and I wonder what, when we're looking at, again, on 4-year schools and grad schools, I think there's a tendency to think of to talk about them all in the same category: colleges and universities, graduate schools. What do we want to do about them in general? What kind of policy do we want to have? But of course, you have, in the U.S. this has a sort of hybrid system where you have a lot of like state colleges and universities that are ultimately run by state governments, and then a lot of private independent ones that have their own endowments and their own trustees and things like that. Is there is there a meaningful difference in higher education policy in terms of the rules the government should be setting, at least, between what does it make sense to have expectations for state versus private schools? Because the state, you know, has to make certain policies for state schools, whereas it would be sort of inappropriate for them to go and try and force private colleges and universities to automatically adopt all those same ideas. Are there two tiers here, or or the most important things expectations we should have of any kind of school?
Yeah, I think that we should have the same, excuse me, the same expectations across the board. If your students are not getting a return on investment, if they are not earning enough to pay back the cost of college, that school should not be eligible for continued federal funding. I do think that states can have a role here in terms of, if states want to set up a college to, provide tuba classes or something, that's not necessarily going to lead to a good return. They certainly have the right to do that if the state legislature wants to vote for that. But that's not something that necessarily that should get federal funding. I do think that we should have kind of the same standards across the board, very high standards for student outcomes, but, we shouldn't discriminate between the types of institutions or, even the form of institutions. So we should have the same standards for colleges and universities as we do for trade schools, apprenticeships, and so forth.
So, excuse me. So one other element of this debate about higher education, if you look at, what are the aspects of this that really break through into the mainstream discourse, into headlines? Like we started with student loan debt is obviously a big one that's been a huge debate. But another one, which is maybe a little sideways to our conversation so far, has been, even when it comes to funding and financing for higher education, there's a lot of complaints from people on the more right, sort of social conservative side, that colleges and universities are too left wing, they're too quote woke, and they're leading our young Americans astray with their crazy radical policies that are being taught by crazy radical tenured professors there. As someone who does a ton of work on higher education policy in general, has that debate on left-wing college, campus craziness, has that spilled over into your work? Do you think that's a distraction from attention people should actually be spending on the stuff that we've been talking about? Like there's a case with like Governor DeSantis and New College of Florida, and them wanting to like change the way that college in particular operates. Is the culture war angle sucking all the oxygen out of the room when it comes to higher education reform?
Well, so I do think that we have been in the popular debates, we have been very focused on the culture war angle, and I don't want to dismiss the importance of that. What's going on college campuses right now with regard to anti-Semitism is just horrible, and a lot of these university presidents who are refusing to condemn the anti-Semitism that's happening on their own campuses. I mean, just shame on them. I do think that it is relevant for the kind of more economic side of this debate, because we do see that polls show plummeting confidence in higher education, especially among folks on the right side of the political spectrum. And so this definitely, the culture wars that are going on college campuses definitely have an impact on the economics, because if fewer parents, fewer students are really confident in the higher education system, that's going to probably lead to fewer people attending college in the first place, which is a trend that we have been seeing over the last few years. We've seen the number of college students, new college students, has been dropping, and so that's why I think that it's really important for colleges to kind of focus on their economic mission, to focus on their mission of advancing economic mobility. Because if they just throw their hands up and say, well, college will make you a better person, and it doesn't really matter if you get an economic return, that's not necessarily an argument that families are buying anymore. And so I do hope that what we're seeing recently does inspire some college campuses to refocus themselves around making sure that students are getting a return on investment, making sure that their programs have more labor market relevance to try and attract some of these folks back to campus and rebuild some of the trust that they have most certainly lost over the last decade or so.
And I'm also wondering what response you've gotten from uh, colleges, college presidents, trustees, administrators, when those rankings of degrees come out from that they're identifiable by institution and by department and by major. The ones that rank the lowest, I imagine there might be some public chagrin to be had by the people who are actually running those programs. But on the other hand, I feel like there might be some quiet people behind the scenes in some of those colleges and universities who are saying to themselves, "Oh, thank God these people are out here actually telling the truth about all this stuff." So I wonder what kind of engagements have you had with people who are current, like faculty administrators, presidents, trustees?
Well, I've certainly gotten a lot of people sending me angry DMs on Twitter. Um, but honestly, the biggest reaction that I've gotten has been positive from the colleges and universities that do very well on our ROI rankings. So the schools that are taking students and they're really equipping them with practical skills, giving them instruction in fields with a lot of labor market relevance, sending them out into the world with a lot of skills and a lot of capacities to do the jobs of the economy of tomorrow. When we recognize schools like that are doing a good job, schools are very grateful for that, and that they because they can show, hey, some of those other guys, they don't necessarily care about students. They're not providing students with economic mobility. They're charging way too much. But if you come here, you can get an inexpensive degree that's going to set you up very well to go out into the labor force and reach a middle class standard of living. That's really the reaction that has stuck with me the most. The folks who have been quietly plodding away. They're not necessarily at the top of the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but they're still doing right by a lot of students. And those are the success stories that I think I've are most important to come out of this project.
Well, shout out to the state school engineering profs out there working in the
Yes,
trenches every day.
Iowa State, one of the best schools in the country by our
Mhm.
ranking, and I'm not sure where they are in the U.S. News and World Report, but they're all over the place in our in the ranking of our top programs.
Excellent. Well, Preston, thank you so much for being here with us and talking us with us about the future of higher education. Uh, Before we go, please tell everyone where they can find you on Twitter or Substack or wherever out there on the internet.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Preston Cooper 93. And if you also go to freopp.org, you can find all of our work on college return on investment. And you can also sign up for our Substack newsletter, which goes out about once a month and brings you the latest news in the world of higher education reform.
All right, excellent. Thanks so much, Preston.
Thank you.